When Rebecca and John moved into their new home, an old Victorian mansion on the outskirts of town, they were excited about the fresh start. The house, with its sprawling gardens and tall Gothic architecture, was everything they had dreamed of. They spent the first few weeks settling in, painting walls and furnishing rooms. Life seemed perfect until the sounds began. It started subtly at first, just the faintest hint of laughter drifting up from the basement. Rebecca dismissed it as her imagination, a trick of the old house's acoustics. But then, one night as she lay in bed, she heard it again, clearer this time. The laughter was unmistakably that of a child, followed by soft crying. She nudged John awake. "John, do you hear that?" she whispered, her voice trembling. He listened for a moment, then shook his head. "It's an old house, Rebecca. It's probably just the wind or the pipes." Rebecca wanted to believe him, but the sounds persisted. Night after night, the laughter and crying grew louder, more insistent. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. One evening, she decided to investigate. She grabbed a flashlight and headed down to the basement. The basement was dark and musty, filled with old furniture and forgotten boxes. Rebecca's flashlight cast long, eerie shadows on the walls. She took a deep breath and called out, "Hello? Is anyone there?" There was no response, only the oppressive silence of the underground space. She shivered and turned to leave, but then she heard it, a soft giggle right behind her. She spun around, her heart pounding in her chest, but there was nothing there. She raced back upstairs, her mind racing. She tried to tell John about it, but he was skeptical. "Rebecca, it's an old house. There are bound to be strange noises. You're just letting it get to you." But Rebecca couldn't let it go. She started hearing the sounds during the day as well. The laughter would echo up through the floorboards, and the crying would start just as she was drifting off to sleep. She began to feel like she was losing her mind. Desperate for answers, she started researching the history of the house. She discovered that the mansion had been built in the late 1800s by a wealthy family named the McAllisters. They had a young daughter named Emily, who had died tragically at the age of 7. The circumstances of her death were shrouded in mystery, and there were rumors that she had been locked in the basement for days before she died. Rebecca's blood ran cold as she read the accounts. Could it be that Emily's spirit was still trapped in the house, trying to reach out to someone, anyone, who would listen? She knew she had to do something to help the lost child. One night, armed with a sense of purpose and a heavy heart, Rebecca descended into the basement again. She carried with her a small toy, a stuffed bear she had found in one of the old boxes. She placed it on the ground and sat down, speaking softly into the darkness. "Emily, if you're here, I want to help you. I'm so sorry for what happened to you. You don't have to be alone anymore." For a moment, there was nothing but silence. Then, the temperature in the room dropped sharply, and Rebecca felt a chill run down her spine. The flashlight flickered and she heard the soft sound of footsteps approaching. She held her breath, her heart pounding in her chest. A faint, translucent figure appeared before her, a little girl with sad eyes and a tattered dress. Rebecca's eyes filled with tears as she looked at the ghostly child. "Emily?" The girl nodded slowly, her eyes filled with sorrow. She reached out and touched the bear, a look of longing on her face. Rebecca wanted to reach out and comfort her, but she was frozen in place. Suddenly, the basement door slammed shut, and the room was plunged into darkness. Rebecca's flashlight went out, and she was left in the pitch black, her breath coming in shallow gasps. She felt a cold hand grip her arm, and she screamed, trying to pull away. The laughter started again, but this time it was different, cruel and mocking. The crying turned to wails of anguish, echoing off the stone walls. Rebecca felt herself being pulled towards the far corner of the basement, where the air was thick with the smell of decay. She struggled, but the grip was unyielding. She felt something cold and clammy wrap around her legs, dragging her down. She screamed for John, for anyone, but her voice was drowned out by the cacophony of sounds. In the darkness, she saw them, other figures, twisted and grotesque, their faces contorted in eternal suffering. They reached out to her, their eyes filled with torment. She realized with horror that she was not the first, and she would not be the last. The house had claimed many victims over the years, and it would continue to do so. Her last thoughts were of John and a desperate hope that he would never come looking for her. She was dragged into the darkness, the laughter and crying fading into a deafening silence. The basement door creaked open, and the house returned to its eerie stillness. The next morning, John woke to find Rebecca gone. He searched the house, calling her name, but there was no answer. He found the basement door ajar and descended the stairs, his heart heavy with dread. He found the stuffed bear lying on the floor, but there was no sign of Rebecca. As he turned to leave, he heard it, the faint sound of a child laughing, followed by soft crying. He felt a chill run down his spine and knew, deep down, that he would never see Rebecca again. The house stood silent and still, the echoes of the past forever haunting its halls. And on quiet nights, if you listened closely, you could still hear the laughter and cries of the lost souls, trapped in the darkness, forever seeking release. When Megan and Thomas moved into the old farmhouse on the outskirts of town, they were thrilled by the prospect of renovating the charming, albeit run-down, property. The house, with its creaking floors and ivy-covered walls, held a rustic allure that spoke of simpler times. The only part of the house they didn't venture into was the basement. The door was firmly locked, and no amount of effort could get it open. They assumed it was simply jammed and put off dealing with it until later. Weeks turned into months, and the couple became increasingly comfortable in their new home. They spent their weekends tearing down old wallpaper, painting, and refinishing the hardwood floors. Everything seemed perfect, until the noises started. It began one night as they lay in bed. Megan woke to the sound of faint scratching, like nails on wood. She nudged Thomas awake, but by the time he was alert, the noise had stopped. He dismissed it as a raccoon or some other animal and went back to sleep. Megan, however, remained uneasy. The scratching became a nightly occurrence. It grew louder and more insistent, waking them both. One night, the sound was accompanied by faint, muffled voices. Megan was certain she could hear a child crying. Terrified, they decided it was time to confront whatever was behind the locked basement door. Armed with a crowbar and a flashlight, Thomas set to work on the door while Megan stood by, clutching a bat. It took several minutes of strenuous effort, but finally, the door gave way with a loud crack and it swung open. A cold, musty draft rushed out, sending chills down their spines. The basement was shrouded in darkness, the air thick with the smell of damp earth and decay. Thomas shone the flashlight down the stairs, revealing a narrow, steep staircase. He took a deep breath and descended, Megan close behind him. The beam of the flashlight swept across the room, revealing old furniture covered in dust and cobwebs. The walls were lined with shelves filled with jars of preserved fruits and vegetables, long past their prime. In the far corner, something glinted in the light. As they approached, they saw an old iron-bound chest. Thomas knelt down and tried to open the chest, but it was locked. Frustrated, he looked around and found a rusty crowbar nearby. He pried the chest open with some effort, and the lid creaked as it revealed its contents. Inside were old photographs, yellowed with age and tattered clothes. But the most disturbing item was a small, ragged doll, its porcelain face cracked and its glass eyes staring blankly. Megan picked up one of the photographs and gasped. It showed a young girl, no older than 7, holding the very same doll. The back of the photo was dated 1924. As they examined the items, the temperature in the room dropped sharply. The flashlight flickered, and they heard a soft giggle, followed by the same scratching sound that had haunted them for weeks. The noise was coming from a large wooden wardrobe against the far wall. Megan and Thomas exchanged uneasy glances. They approached the wardrobe slowly, the flashlight beam quivering in Thomas's hand. He reached out and pulled the doors open, revealing a dark, empty space. But the scratching continued, louder now, as if something or someone was inside the walls. Suddenly, the flashlight went out, plunging them into darkness. Megan screamed and Thomas fumbled to turn it back on. When the light returned, they saw it, a small, pale hand reaching out from behind the wardrobe. The hand withdrew quickly, and the wardrobe slammed shut with a force that sent dust and debris flying. They stumbled back, their hearts racing. The basement filled with an oppressive silence, broken only by the sound of their own ragged breathing. They fled upstairs, slamming the basement door behind them. They agreed not to return, but the events of that night plagued their thoughts. The scratching and the crying grew louder each night, now accompanied by whispers that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. Megan and Thomas found themselves growing more paranoid and sleep-deprived. The air in the house grew colder, and a sense of dread hung over them. One night, driven by desperation, Thomas decided they had to get rid of the chest and its contents. He dragged it out to the backyard and doused it with gasoline. As he struck the match, he heard the whispering again, louder than ever. The flames roared to life, consuming the chest, but the whispers didn't stop. They grew louder, more frantic, and the scratching became a deafening roar. Megan screamed as the house shook, and the basement door burst open with a violent force. From the darkness emerged the figure of the young girl, her eyes filled with sorrow and anger. She reached out towards them, her mouth moving but no sound coming out. The air around them grew colder still, and they felt an overwhelming sense of despair. Thomas grabbed Megan's hand, and they ran from the house, not stopping until they reached their car. They drove to the nearest motel, too afraid to return. The next morning, they contacted a local historian to learn more about the house. They discovered that in 1924, a family had lived in the farmhouse. The youngest daughter, Emily, had mysteriously disappeared, and her body was never found. Rumors circulated that she had been locked in the basement by her abusive father, left to die alone in the darkness. Horrified, Megan and Thomas knew they could never return to the house. They put it up for sale, but potential buyers were scared off by the eerie atmosphere and the strange noises. The house stood empty, its windows dark and foreboding. Years later, it became known as the Crying House, and locals would dare each other to spend a night there. Few lasted until dawn. They all reported the same sounds, scratching, crying, and the whispers of a young girl lost in the shadows. The house remained abandoned, a dark presence lingering within its walls, and on quiet nights when the wind was still, you could still hear the desperate cries of a child, forever trapped behind the locked basement door. The old Victorian house had stood on the outskirts of town for over a century, its once grand facade now shrouded in creeping ivy and shadow. When Lydia and Mark bought the house, they were enchanted by its history and character. The realtor had mentioned the basement in passing, noting it was full of old junk from previous owners, but they paid little attention. They were more interested in the large, airy rooms and the beautiful garden. It wasn't until they started cleaning out the basement that they found the mirror. The basement was damp and cluttered with forgotten furniture, boxes of mildewed books, and rusty tools. Lydia was moving a stack of crates when she uncovered it, an ornate, full-length mirror with a heavy, carved wooden frame. The glass was cloudy with age, and the frame was adorned with intricate designs of twisting vines and strange, almost humanoid figures. "Look at this," Lydia called to Mark, who was rummaging through a pile of old newspapers. He came over, wiping his hands on his jeans. "Wow, that's something else. Must be an antique." "It's beautiful," Lydia said, running her fingers over the carved frame. "We should clean it up and bring it upstairs." Mark nodded, and together they carefully moved the mirror to a clear spot in the basement. Lydia fetched a cloth and some glass cleaner and began to polish the surface. As the grime was wiped away, the reflection grew clearer, but something about it seemed off. The glass had a strange, almost liquid quality, as if it were a portal to another world. That night, as they lay in bed, Lydia couldn't shake the feeling of unease. She dreamed of the mirror, of shadowy figures moving behind the glass, their faces contorted in silent screams. She woke with a start, her heart pounding. Mark was asleep beside her, undisturbed. She tried to tell herself it was just a dream, but the feeling lingered. The next day, they brought the mirror upstairs and placed it in the hallway. It seemed to add a touch of elegance to the house, its dark frame contrasting with the light walls. But as the days passed, Lydia started noticing strange things. Reflections in the mirror seemed slightly distorted, like a funhouse mirror, and sometimes, out of the corner of her eye, she thought she saw movement. One evening, as she was passing the mirror on her way to the kitchen, she glanced at her reflection and froze. For a split second, her reflection didn't mimic her movements. Instead, it stared back at her with wide, unblinking eyes, a look of sheer terror on its face. She blinked, and the reflection was normal again. Shaking, she rushed to tell Mark. "There's something wrong with that mirror," she said, her voice trembling. "I saw something not right." Mark frowned. "It's just an old mirror, Lydia. Maybe you're just tired." "No, it's more than that. I think it's haunted." Mark laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Come on, ghosts? In a mirror? That's just superstition." But Lydia couldn't let it go. She started researching the house's history, looking for any clues about the mirror's origins. She found that the house had belonged to a man named Elias Turner, a reclusive artist who was rumored to dabble in the occult. According to local legend, Turner had disappeared under mysterious circumstances, and his house had been sold with all its contents intact. Driven by a growing sense of dread, Lydia decided to confront the mirror directly. She waited until Mark was out, and then she stood in front of it, staring into its depths. She spoke softly, her voice barely above a whisper. "Who are you? What do you want?" For a moment, there was nothing. Then the glass began to ripple, like water disturbed by a pebble. A face emerged from the depths of the mirror, pale and gaunt, with hollow eyes and a mouth twisted in a silent scream. Lydia stumbled back, her heart racing. The face in the mirror spoke, its voice a faint, echoing whisper. "Help me." Lydia felt a chill run down her spine. "Who are you?" "Trapped. He trapped us." The voice faded, and the face dissolved back into the rippling glass. Terrified, Lydia decided they had to get rid of the mirror. When Mark came home, she told him everything. He was skeptical, but agreed to move it back to the basement. They lugged it down the stairs and covered it with an old sheet, hoping that would be the end of it. But the house seemed to change after that. Shadows moved in the corners of their vision, and strange noises echoed through the halls at night. Lydia's dreams grew more vivid and horrifying. She saw the basement, filled with figures trapped behind the glass, their faces twisted in agony. One night, she woke to find Mark gone. She searched the house frantically, calling his name, but there was no answer. Driven by a growing sense of dread, she made her way to the basement. The door creaked open, and she descended the stairs, her heart pounding. The mirror stood in the center of the room, the sheet lying crumpled on the floor. The glass was clear and cold, and as she approached, she saw Mark's reflection staring back at her, his face pale and eyes wide with fear. "Mark?" she whispered, reaching out to touch the glass. His reflection mirrored her movements, but as her fingers brushed the surface, his face twisted in terror. "Lydia, help me! It's pulling me in!" She tried to pull him away, but her hands passed through the glass as if it were water. She felt a cold, clammy hand grip her wrist, pulling her towards the mirror. She struggled, but the grip was unyielding. The glass rippled, and she was pulled into the mirror. Inside, the world was dark and distorted. She saw other faces around her, trapped in the glass, their eyes filled with despair. Mark was there, reaching out to her, but she couldn't reach him. The faces closed in, whispering in anguished tones. "Join us, trapped forever." The mirror in the basement stood silent and still, its surface smooth and unbroken. The house above remained quiet, its dark secrets hidden from the outside world. The next owners would find the mirror, an antique curiosity, and they too would fall victim to its haunting allure. And on quiet nights, if you listened closely, you could still hear their whispers, pleading for release from their glassy prison, forever trapped in the darkness of the old mirror in the basement. It was a typical autumn evening when David discovered the hidden door in his basement. He had been living in the old Victorian house for 6 months, spending most of his free time renovating and restoring it. The house, with its ornate woodwork and stained glass windows, had always fascinated him, but the basement was a different story. It was dark, damp, and filled with a sense of foreboding. David had decided to clean out the basement, hoping to turn it into a usable space. As he moved aside a stack of old wooden crates, he noticed something unusual. There, in the far corner, was a section of the wall that looked different from the rest. The bricks were newer, and there was a faint outline of a door. Curiosity piqued. He cleared away the rest of the crates and examined the wall closely. He could feel a slight draft coming from the edges of the outline. His fingers traced the edges until he found a small, almost invisible latch. With a mix of excitement and apprehension, he pulled the latch, and the door swung open with a creak. Behind the door was a narrow, dimly lit staircase that descended into darkness. The air was cold and smelled of damp earth and decay. David hesitated for a moment, then grabbed a flashlight from his toolbox. He had always been adventurous, and the mystery of the hidden door was too intriguing to ignore. He descended the stairs cautiously, the beam of his flashlight cutting through the thick darkness. The steps were steep and uneven, and he had to grip the railing to keep his balance. As he reached the bottom, he found himself in a small, stone-lined room. The walls were covered in strange symbols and markings, and in the center of the room was an old wooden chest. David approached the chest, his heart pounding in his chest. He knelt down and examined it. The wood was dark and worn, and the metal fittings were rusted with age. Taking a deep breath, he opened the chest. Inside, he found an assortment of odd and disturbing items: old photographs, tattered books, and a collection of small, strange objects that looked like they belonged in a witch's apothecary. Among the items was a leather-bound journal. David picked it up and opened it, the pages yellowed and brittle. The handwriting was spidery and difficult to read, but he could make out enough to understand that it was a diary of sorts. The entries were filled with accounts of strange rituals and dark ceremonies that had taken place in the basement over a century ago. As he read, he felt a growing sense of dread. The last entry was particularly disturbing. It spoke of a ritual that had gone wrong, unleashing something dark and sinister that had been trapped in the basement ever since. The writer warned that the door must remain sealed to keep the entity contained. David's flashlight flickered, and he felt a chill run down his spine. He looked around the room, the shadows seeming to move and shift in the dim light. He decided he had seen enough. He closed the chest and hurried back up the stairs, his footsteps echoing in the confined space. He closed the hidden door behind him and piled the crates back in front of it, trying to ignore the growing sense of unease. That night, David had trouble sleeping. He kept hearing strange noises coming from the basement, faint whispers, creaking floorboards, and a low, rhythmic thumping sound. He told himself it was just his imagination, the result of reading the disturbing journal. But deep down, he knew something was wrong. Over the next few days, the noises grew louder and more frequent. Objects in the house started moving on their own, and David felt an oppressive presence watching him. One night, he woke to find the hidden door in the basement wide open, even though he had locked it and barricaded it with the crates. Terrified, he called a local historian to ask about the house's history. The historian told him that the house had once belonged to a reclusive occultist who was rumored to have practiced dark magic. According to legend, the occultist had tried to summon a powerful entity but had lost control, resulting in his mysterious disappearance. The house had been abandoned for years before David bought it. David knew he had to do something to stop whatever was happening. He decided to perform a cleansing ritual he found in the journal, hoping it would banish the entity for good. He gathered the necessary items and went down to the basement one last time. He set up the ritual in the stone room, following the instructions carefully. As he began the incantation, the air grew colder, and the shadows seemed to close in around him. The symbols on the walls began to glow with an eerie light, and the whispers grew louder, more insistent. Suddenly, the room was plunged into darkness, and David felt a cold hand grip his shoulder. He tried to continue the incantation, but his voice was drowned out by a deafening roar. The ground shook, and he was thrown across the room. The last thing he saw was a pair of glowing red eyes staring at him from the darkness. The next morning, David's neighbors called the police after hearing strange noises coming from the house. The authorities found the basement door open and the stone room in disarray. David was nowhere to be found, and the hidden door was sealed shut once again, the latch broken and unmovable. The house was abandoned, and rumors spread about the dark events that had taken place there. People claimed to hear whispers and see shadows moving in the windows at night. No one dared to enter the basement, fearing the entity that still lurked within. To this day, the house remains empty, a dark reminder of the horrors hidden behind that secret door in the basement. And on cold, dark nights, if you listen closely, you can still hear David's desperate cries for help, trapped forever in the darkness.